said you had to start with neurons or physical systems and boot up consciousness.
You guys are just...
You chose that problem. So since you chose that problem, how much progress have you made? Well, when you've not been able to come up with a single specific conscious experience, and you've had these brilliant people working on it for decades now, that's not really good progress.
Let me ask you to play devil's advocate. Can you try to steel man meaning argue the best possible case for reality, the opposite of your book title? So, or maybe just sticking to consciousness. Can you take the physicalist view? Can you steel man the physicalist view for a brief moment, playing devil's advocate to, or steel man the person you used to be?
Right.
The physicalist. What's a good, like saying that you might be wrong right now? What would be a convincing argument for that?
Well, I think the argument I would give and that I believed was, look, when you have very simple physical systems, like a piece of dirt, there's not much evidence of life or consciousness. It's only when you get really complicated physical systems like that have brains, and really the more complicated the brains, the more it looks like there's consciousness, and the more complicated that consciousness is. Surely that means that simple physical systems don't create much consciousness, or if maybe not any, or maybe if panpsychists, they create the most elementary kinds of simple conscious experiences. But you need more complicated physical systems to boot up, to create more complicated consciousnesses. I think that's the intuition that drives most of my colleagues.
And you're saying that this concept of complexity is ill-defined when you ground it to space-time?
I think it's well-defined within the framework of space-time, right?
No, it's ill-defined relative to what you need to actually understand consciousness, because you're grounding complexity in space-time.
Oh, got you. Right. Yeah. What I'm saying is, if it were true that space-time was fundamental, then I would have to agree that if there is such a thing as consciousness, given the data that we've got, that complex brains have consciousness and dirt doesn't, that somehow it's the complexity of the dynamics or organization, the function of the physical system that somehow is creating the consciousness. So under those assumptions, yes. But when the physicists themselves are telling us that space-time is not fundamental, then I can understand. See, then the whole picture starts to come into focus. Why my colleagues are brilliant, right? These are really smart people. I mean, Francis Crick worked on this for the last 20 years of his life. These are not stupid people. These are brilliant people. The fact that we've come up with not a single specific conscious experience that we can explain, and no hope. There's no one that says, oh, I'm really close, so I'll have it for you in a year. No, there's just like, there's this fundamental gap. So much so that Steve Pinker, in one of his writings, says, look, he likes the global workspace theory. But he says that last dollop of the theory, in which there's something it's like to, he said we may have to just stipulate that as a brute fact. I mean, and Pinker is brilliant, right? He understands the state of play on this problem of the hard problem of consciousness, starting with physicalist assumptions and then trying to put up consciousness. And you've set yourself the problem. I'm starting with physical stuff that's not conscious. I'm trying to get the taste of chocolate out as maybe some kind of function of the dynamics of that. We've not been able to do that. And so Pinker is saying we may have to punt. We may have to just stipulate that last bit, he calls it the last dollop, and just stipulate it as a bare fact of nature that there is something as life. Well, from my point of view, the whole promise of the physicalist was we wouldn't have to stipulate. I was going to start with the physical stuff and explain where the consciousness came from. If I'm going to stipulate consciousness, why don't I just stipulate consciousness and not stipulate all the physical stuff too? So I'm stipulating less. I'm saying, okay, I agree.
The panpsychist perspective.
Well, it's actually what I call the conscious realist perspective.
Conscious realist.
Panpsychists are effectively dualists, right? They're saying there's physical stuff that really is fundamental, and then consciousness stuff. So I would go with Pinker and say, look, let's just stipulate the consciousness stuff. But I'm not going to stipulate the physical stuff. I'm going to actually now show how to boot up the physical stuff from just the consciousness stuff. So I'll stipulate less.
Is it possible? So, if you stipulate less, is it possible for our limited brains to visualize reality as we delve deeper and deeper and deeper? Is it possible to visualize somehow? With the tools of math, with the tools of computers, with the tools of our mind, are we hopelessly lost? You said there's ways to intuit what's true using mathematics and probability and sort of Markovian dynamics, all that kind of stuff. But that's not visualizing. That's a kind of building intuition. But is it possible to visualize in the way we visualize so nicely in space-time in 4 dimensions, in 3 dimensions? Sorry. Well, we really are looking through a 2-dimensional screen until it's what we intuit to be a 3-dimensional world, and also inferring dynamic stuff, making it 4D. Anyway, is it possible to visualize some pretty pictures that give us a deeper sense of the truth of reality?
I think that we will incrementally be able to do that. I think that, for example, the picture that we have of electrons and photons interacting and scattering it may have not been possible until Faraday did all of his experiments and then Maxwell wrote down his equations, and we were then sort of forced by his equations to think in a new way. And then when Planck in 1900, desperate to try to solve the problem of black body radiation, what they call the ultraviolet catastrophe, where Newton was predicting infinite energies where there weren't infinite energies in black body radiation. And he, in desperation, proposed packets of energy. Then once you've done that, and then you have an Einstein come along 5 years later and show how that explains the photoelectric effect. And then eventually in 1926 you get quantum theory. And then you get this whole new way of thinking that was, from the Newtonian point of view, completely contradictory and counterintuitive, certainly. Yeah, and maybe if Jason is right, not contradictory. Maybe if you use intuitionist method, not contradictory, but still, certainly you wouldn't have gone there. And so here's a case where the experiments and then a desperate mathematical move, sort of we use those as a flashlight into the deep fog. Right, and so that science may be the flashlight into the deep fog.
Yeah, I wonder if it's still possible to visualize we talk about consciousness from a self perspective, experience it, hold that idea in our mind, the way you can experience things directly. We've evolved to experience things in this 3D world, and that's a very rich experience. When you're thinking mathematically, you still, in the end of the day, have to project it down to low dimensional space to make conclusions. Your conclusions will be a number, or a line, or a plot, or a visual. So I wonder, how we can really touch some deep truth in a subjective way, experience it, really feel the beauty of it, in the way that humans feel beauty.
Right.
Or are we screwed?
I don't think we're screwed. I think that we get little hints of it from psychedelic drugs and so forth. We get hints that there are certain interventions that we can take on our interface. I apply this chemical, which is just some element of my interface, to this other, to a brain. I ingest it. And all of a sudden, I seem like I've opened new portals into conscious experiences. Well, that's very, very suggestive. That's like the black body radiation doing something that we didn't expect, right? It doesn't go to infinity when we thought it was going to go to infinity, and we're forced to propose these quanta. So once we have a theory of conscious agents and is projection into space-time, I should sketch what I think that projection is. But then I think we can then start to ask specific questions. When you're taking DMT, or you're taking LSD or something like that, now that we have this deep model, we've reverse engineered space and time and physical particles, we've pulled them back to this theory of conscious agents. Now we can ask ourselves, in this idealized future, what are we doing to conscious agents when we apply 5-MeO-DMT? What are we doing? Are we opening a new portal, right? So when I say that, I mean, I have a portal into consciousness that I call my body of Lex Friedman that I'm creating. And it's a genuine portal, not perfect, but it's a genuine portal. I'm definitely communicating with your consciousness. And we know that we have one technology for building new portals. We know one technology, and that is having kids. Having kids is how we build new portals into consciousness. It takes a long time.
Can you elaborate that? You mean like...
Your son and your daughter didn't exist. That was a portal. You're having contact with consciousness that you never would have had before. But now you've got a son or a daughter. You went through this physical process. They were born. Then there was all the...
But is that portal yours? So when you have kids, are you creating new portals that are completely distinct from the portals that you've created with other consciousness? Like, can you elaborate on that? To which degree are the consciousness of your kids a part of you?
Well, so every person that I see, that symbol that I see, the body that I see, is a portal potentially for me to interact with a consciousness.
Yeah.
And each consciousness has a unique character. We call it a personality, right, and so forth. So with each new kid that's born, we come in contact with a personality that we've never seen before, and a version of consciousness that we've never seen before. At a deeper level, as I said, the theory says there's one agent. So this is a different projection of that one agent. But so that's what I mean by a portal is within my own interface, my own projection, can I see other projections of that one consciousness? So can I get portals in that sense? And I think we will get a theory of that we will get a theory of portals, and then we can ask how the psychedelics are acting. Are they actually creating new portals or not? If they're not, we should nevertheless then understand how we could create a new portal, right? Maybe we have to just study what happens when we have kids. We know that technology creates new portals. So we have to reverse engineer that and then say, okay, could we somehow create new portals de novo with that?
With something like brain-computer interfaces, for example.
Yeah, or maybe just a chemical or something like that. So it's probably more complicated than a chemical. That's why I think that the psychedelics may, because they might be affecting this portal in certain ways that it turns it around and opens up. In other words, it maybe once we understand what this thing is a portal, your body is a portal, and understand all of its complexities, maybe we'll realize that portal can be shifted and to different parts of the deeper consciousness and give new windows on it. And so in that way, maybe, yes, psychedelics could open up new portals in the sense that they're taking something that's already a complex portal and just tweaking it a bit.
Well, but creating is a very powerful difference between morphing.
Right. Tweaking versus creating. I agree.
But maybe it gives you intuition to at least the full space of the kinds of things that this particular system is capable of. I mean, the idea, your idea that consciousness creates brains. I mean, that breaks my brain because I guess I'm still a physicalist in that sense, because it's just much easier to intuit the world. It's practical to think, all right, there's a neural network, and what are the different ways fascinating capabilities can emerge from this neural network.
I agree. It's easier.
And so you start to, and then present to yourself the problem of, okay, well, how does consciousness arise? How does intelligence arise? How does emotion arise? How does memory arise? And how do we filter within this system all the incoming sensory information? We're able to allocate attention in different interesting ways. How do all those mechanisms arise? To say that there's other fundamental things we don't understand outside of space-time that are actually core to how this whole thing works is a bit paralyzing, because it's like, oh, we're not 10% done. We're like 0.001% done.
Well,
It's the immediate feeling.
I certainly understand that. My attitude about it is, if you look at the young physicists who are searching for these structures beyond space-time, like amplitude and so forth, they're having a ball. Space-time, that's what the old folks did. That's what the older generation did. We're doing something that really is fun and new, and they're having a blast, and they're finding all these new structures. So I think that we're going to succeed in getting a new, deeper theory. I can just say what I'm hoping with the theory that I'm working on. I'm hoping to show that I could have this timeless dynamics of consciousness, no entropic time. I take a projection, and I show how this timeless dynamics looks like the Big Bang and the entire evolution of space-time. In other words, I see how my whole space-time interface.
So not just the projection doesn't just look like space-time. You can explain
The whole,
the whole from the origin of the universe.
That's what we have to do, and that's what the physicists understand. When they go beyond space-time to the amplitude and the cosmological polytope, they ultimately know that they have to get back the Big Bang story and the whole evolution, that whole story where there were no living things. There was just a point. And then the explosion, and then just particles at high energy, and then eventually the cooling down and the differentiation, and finally matter condenses, and then life, and then consciousness. That whole story has to come out of something that's deeper and without time. And that's what we're up to. That's we want to get that. So the whole story that we've been telling ourselves about Big Bang and how brains evolved in consciousness will come out of a much deeper theory. And for someone like me, it's a lot. I mean, but for the younger generation, this is like, oh wow, all the low cherries aren't picked. This is really good stuff. This is really new, fundamental stuff that we can do. So I can't wait to read the papers of the younger generation, and I want to see them.
Kids these days with their non-space-time assumptions. It's just interesting looking at the philosophical tradition of the difficult ideas you struggle with. If you look like somebody like Immanuel Kant, what are some interesting agreements and disagreements you have with a guy about the nature of reality?
So there's a lot in agreement, right? So Kant was an idealist, transcendental idealist, and he basically had the idea that we don't see nature as it is. We impose a structure on nature. And so in some sense, I'm saying something similar. I'm saying that, by the way, I don't call myself an idealist. I call myself a conscious realist, because idealism has a long history. A lot of different ideas come under idealism, and there's a lot of debates and so forth. It tends to be identified with, in many cases, anti-science and anti-realism. And I don't want either connection with my ideas, and so I just called mine conscious realism with an emphasis on realism, and not anti-realism. But the one place where I would, of course, disagree with Kant was that he thought that Euclidean space-time was a priori, right? We just know that that's false. So he went too far on that. But in general, the idea that we don't start with space-time, that space and time is, in some sense, the forms of our perceptions. Yes, absolutely. And I would say that, there's a lot in common with Berkeley in that regard. There's a lot of ingenious arguments in Berkeley. Leibniz, in his monadology, understood very clearly that the hard problem was not solvable. He posed the hard problem and basically dismissed it. Just, you can't do this. And so if he came here, and saw where we are, he'd say, look, guys, I told you this 300 years ago. And he had his monadology. He was trying to do something like this. It's different from what I'm doing, but he had these things that were not in space and time, these monads. He was trying to build something. I'm trying to build a theory of conscious agents. My guess is that if he came here, I could just if he saw what I was doing, he would understand it and immediately take off with it and go places that I couldn't. He would
So
have
there
no
would be,
problems.
there would be overlap of the spirit of the ideas.
Absolutely.
Would be totally overlapping.
But his genius would then just run with it far faster than I could.
I love the humility here. So let me ask you about sort of practical implications of your ideas to our world, our complicated world. When you look at the big questions of humanity, of hate, war, what else is there? Evil, maybe there's the positive aspects of that, of meaning, of love. What is the fact that reality is an illusion? Perceived, what is the conscious realism when applied to daily life? What kind of impact does it have?
A lot. And it's sort of scary. We all know that life is ephemeral. And spiritual traditions have said, wake up to the fact that, anything that you do here is going to disappear. But it's even more ephemeral than perhaps we've thought. I see this bottle because I create it right now. As soon as I look away, that data structure has been garbage collected. That bottle, I have to recreate it every time I look. So I spend all my money and I buy this fancy car. That car, I have to keep recreating it every time I look at it. It's that ephemeral. So all the things that we invest ourselves in, we fight over, we kill each other over, we have wars over. These are all, it's just like people in a virtual reality simulation. Right? And there's this Porsche. We all see the Porsche. Well, that Porsche exists when I look at it. I turn my headset and I look at it. And then if Joe turns his headset the right way, he'll see his Porsche. It's not even the same Porsche that I see. He's creating his own Porsche. So these things are exceedingly ephemeral. And now, just imagine saying that that's my Porsche. Well, you can agree to say that it's your Porsche, but really, the Porsche only exists as long as you look. So this, all of a sudden, what the spiritual traditions have been saying for a long, long time, this gets cashed out in mathematically precise science. It's saying ephemeral, yes, in fact, it lasts for a few milliseconds, a few hundred milliseconds while you look at it, and then it's gone. So the whole idea, why are we fighting? Why do we hate? We fight over possessions because we think that we're small little objects inside this pre-existing space-time. We assume that mansion and that car exists independent of us, and that somehow these little things, can have our sense of self and importance enhanced by having that special car or that special house or that special person. When in fact, it's just the opposite. You create that mansion every time you look. You're something far deeper than that mansion. You're the entity which can create that mansion on the fly. And there's nothing to the mansion except what you create in this moment. So all of a sudden, when you take this point of view, it has all sorts of implications for how we interact with each other, how we treat each other. And again, a lot of things that spiritual traditions have said, it's a mixed bag. Spiritual traditions are a mixed bag, so let me just be right up front about that. I'm not promoting any particular, but they do have some insights.
Yeah, they have wisdom.
They have certain wisdom. I can point to nonsense, I won't go into it, but I can also point to lots of nonsense. So the issue is to look for the key insights. And I think they have a lot of insights about the ephemeral nature of objects in space and time and not being attached to them, including our own bodies, and reversing that I'm not this little thing, a little consciousness trapped in the body. And the consciousness itself is only a product of the body. So when the body dies, the consciousness disappears. It turns completely around. The consciousness is fundamental. The body, my hand exists.
Battery's dying.
I'm looking at it.